Understanding web color will be critical when it comes to creating content for the web, obviously. Now, if you've completed our Photoshop Fundamentals course, I'm assuming that you already know what the RGB color space is. When monitors display color, they're mixing red, green, and blue color values. These red, green, and blue color values can be represented in many different ways inside of CSS and HTML. So what I'd like to do is kind of point out how you can come up with color values and how those values are in fact represented. Again, referring back to the Fundamentals course, you know that the RGB color space works with red, green, and blue. And if you wanted to display a pure red color, you'd be looking at the red channel having a value of 255, whereas the green and blue channels would have values of 0. When you're working on the web, you can certainly express color values in RGB. Another common way, which I want to talk about first, is something called hexadecimal values, or hex codes. Now, in order for you to see a hex code, what you can do is come over here to the foreground or background swatch and double-click it. That will open up the color picker. And you'll notice here in the color picker, you can choose color based upon hue, saturation, and brightness, lab color values, CMYK, of course RGB, but down here towards the bottom, you'll also notice that there's a hexadecimal code. Now, it's really impossible to know what hexadecimal values represent unless you work with them a lot. Now, there are some simple hex codes that many people remember. For example, if you wanted to represent black in a hex code, it would simply be 6 zeros. And you'll notice that that's the new color here. What if you wanted to display something like white? Well, you can do that with 6 Fs. Now, as we talk about this, it's important to understand that hex codes are represented in values between 0 and 9 and A through F. The brightest or most saturated values would be the highest value within that spectrum. So F would be the highest value. So if you wanted to see a pure red that's very saturated, you would assign FF to the red channel, 00 to the green channel, and 00 to the blue channel, and that will give you a red color. So that's what hexadecimal values are. Now, you can play with hex codes in the color panel inside of Photoshop. In the color panel, in the top right-hand corner, you can come over and choose Web Color Sliders. When you do that, you'll notice you get the red, green, and blue sliders. Then you see the corresponding hex code associated with it. Now, on the web, you would use a hexadecimal value, typically within CSS, to express a particular color value. A very common way to also express color values is simply by using RGB values. And again, here inside of Photoshop, in the color panel, in the top right-hand corner, you can choose RGB sliders. And again, the easiest way to remember how these work is that the maximum value is 255. So if you wanted a pure blue, you would set the red slider to 0, the green slider to 0, and the blue slider to 255. That's going to be the brightest, most saturated blue that you can produce using RGB. And of course, in CSS, you can easily express that value using the RGB color option. Now, RGBA is also becoming very popular because A stands for alpha. So you can provide a value for red, green, blue, and also alpha. So in this case, I have this rectangle. And this rectangle has color values associated with it. The color values associated with it are 0 for red, 0 for green, and 255 for blue, but you'll notice that the opacity here on the layer is set to 90%. So if you were to represent this in CSS, the values would be 0 for red, 0 for green, 255 for blue, and 90 for alpha. And this gives you the ability to display transparency within your color values using CSS. So as you create artwork and content for on-screen delivery, it is important to know that these color values will be expressed either using hexadecimal codes or the RGB color values And of course, now you can also use alpha values with those RGB color values.